But the backdrop is in the Gandhar region of Afghanistan, there were two statues of the Buddha from the 6th century, both very large. One was 125 feet tall, the other one was 180 feet tall. They were carved into sandstone cliffs, and they were destroyed. The destruction started on March 2nd. Members of the Taliban started firing guns and artillery at the statues. And by March 18th, the final explosives had been set in place, and the statues were demolished. A gut-wrenching event. They were a UNESCO historical site. Obviously, the Taliban had no right to do this. Other countries, including Spain offered to dismantle the statues and move them. And the Taliban said, no, they must be destroyed. And the Taliban went ahead with this. What that tells us was in this region, if you've got resources and available work to build statues like this, Buddhism must have been very ingrained in the local society and must have had a lot of support. And we have an account of a Chinese historian named Xu Zhang, who visited the Bactrian region in 630. And he said there was 10 large monasteries in that area and over 10,000 monks. So Buddhism had quite a following in this region of Afghanistan. The earliest Buddhist writings from this part of the world, and inscriptions and murals and paintings, date to about 250 BC. So this is one of the first areas where Buddhism became established after leaving India. That's very interesting. So the question is, how did this happen? And the other question that I want to look into is, where did these schools of Buddhism go? How were they different from what was established farther east? So that sets us up for the talk, which is titled, Buddhism Went West. And so what happened was, around 230, a warlord named Ashoka becomes emperor of the Indian subcontinent. First time this had happened, he conquers the entire subcontinent. And he apparently was quite a guy, very bloodthirsty, very driven. And there's accounts of him doing things like beheading 500 of his concubines at once because they picked flowers off of his favorite trees. He apparently was completely ruthless in battle. And interesting, because his name, Ashoka, means without sorrow. And so here's a guy without sorrow that's obviously causing a lot of sorrow for other people. One of the interesting stories about him is in one of his earliest battles, he didn't arm any of his troops and marched them into battle and said, if we're meant to win this, arms will appear, we'll have weapons. And somehow the gods looked on Ashoka, and his troops were provided with weapons. Kind of an oddball story. So he took that as divine providence, that he was to be the universal leader of this entire continent. At the Battle of Kalinga, Kalinga was one of the kingdoms of India that he conquered. It is said that he caused, directly because of his campaign, 100,000 deaths and 150,000 deportations. That is obviously a lot of sorrow. And this caused a psychic break with him. He had a tough time reconciling what he did and what he had done and everything that he had done to get to this point. So he became a Buddhist and thought that was the best way to change his karma. And most historians don't agree on whether this conversion was gradual or if it was just one overnight event and he wakes up and says, I need to be a Buddhist. But one way or the other, he did become Buddhist, and apparently underwent a great change in personality and decided that he was going to rule the empire with a lot of compassion and a lot of grace. So that probably is a good thing for the for the Indian subcontinent. One of the first things he did was convene the Third Council. And so he went to the leading Buddhist clerics at the time and basically said, this is going to be the state religion. And we're going to take this everywhere that we go. And I need you to codify this for me so I can take it with me and I know what I'm doing. And my emissaries know what they're doing. So it went to two of the places that he conquered after he had conquered the Indian subcontinent. One was the region of Bactria, which we now call Afghanistan. And he basically took over the kingdom of Bactria from the descendants of Alexander the Great and sent Buddhist emissaries. And this would have been about 250. So this is really early. This is a few hundred years before they can actually verify that Buddhism was very extensive in China. So we've got historical evidence that Buddhism went west before it went north and east. That's kind of interesting because we have a very different culture in Bactria. Bactria was heavily influenced by the Greeks that had conquered it. So you have this mixture of Buddhist teachings and Hellenistic culture. And I'm not an art historian. It's not something I have any expertise in. But allegedly, if you look at the art from this period, the Buddhist art from this period, this part of the world, there's a very heavy Hellenistic influence. And, if the art is influenced that way, we can make an extrapolation that the philosophy probably was as well. Okay, now we get to kind of the tough part. There's very little historical writing of what Buddhism was like in Greek areas of the world and Roman areas of the world. There's a handful of accounts, and that's pretty much it. But one of the things that they do agree on is that there were Buddhist groups in larger cities like Alexandria and Jerusalem and Rome. There is one account from 17 AD of an emissary to Rome, a Buddhist emissary that was going to see Caesar Augustus. And it was a monk, and his name was Zarma no Chigas. And he burned himself alive in Athens. And the historians at the time said he did it to immortalize his faith. I can't imagine that's all there was to it. And the first thing that probably comes to mind is the well-known monk that immolated himself in Vietnam at the start of the Vietnam War to protest the treatment of Buddhist monks in that time and place. So I think we can assume that was something slightly similar. But one of the things to keep in mind about the Gandhar region in that time and place of the world is where it was located. And it was located on something called the Silk Road. And the Silk Road was at that time the main highway between the Middle East and Europe and China. It was where trade took place, and obviously a lot of cultural information went from one place to the other. So here we have Buddhism in about 250 AD, established on this highway at the time. And it explains why Buddhism went in that direction before it went north. Because if you've ever been to that part of the world, what you've got between India and Nepal and China is the Himalayas and the Gobi Desert. And I have not been in the Gobi, but I have been in the Himalayas, and I can tell you it's a very, very tough place to travel. You're not going to get a lot of information going back and forth. Most historians think that that the highlands of Nepal, the Khumbu region, weren't even settled until about 1500 by the Sherpa. Sherpa is actually, the word translates to Easterner. So they came from the Tibetan plateau into the highlands of Nepal. And before that, it probably was not, it was very, very sparsely populated, if populated at all. So it's pretty unlikely that you're going to have monks wander over these mountains into China and take Buddhism with them. So that kind of brings us to, well, how did Buddhism actually get into China? And most likely through the Silk Road. And as we know, the most well-known person to have done this would have been Bodhidharma. And if you look at Bodhidharma historically, he's the 28th patriarch, the first patriarch in China. And the earliest Chinese sources from the 500s and 600s tell us that Bodhidharma was Persian. They describe him as a Persian madman or a blue-eyed devil. And they say that he had red hair and a bushy red beard and blue eyes. Doesn't sound like an Indian to me. So we have these sources that claim, and they also say that he came from Western regions. And at the time, the word Western region meant to the Chinese anything that basically wasn't China. So it's a little unclear there, but I think that the historical evidence that Bodhidharma might have been Central Asian is pretty strong. It wasn't until Bodhidharma had been dead for about 200 years that one historian basically said, no, he wasn't Persian. He was actually Southern Indian, and he was from a Brahmin family. But this is one guy. Bodhidharma had been dead for 200 years. We have no idea what the political implications of making up a story like that was. For some reason, there was a movement to declare Bodhidharma as not being a Persian, and that's been lost to history. But Bodhidharma has always been credited with the man who brought Mahayana Buddhism into China. Even though there's some evidence that there was already Buddhism there, it's just historically very unclear what it was. But Bodhidharma is the guy that's credited with Mahayana. His successor, Hui Ke, there's some really well-known stories there. Bodhidharma refused to teach him, and he stood in snow until the snow gathered up to his waist, and Bodhidharma told him to go away. He goes, I don't think you're sincere. I think you're arrogant, and I'm not going to teach you. So his response to that was to hack off his own left arm to show his sincerity. And after that, Bodhidharma said, you must be pretty serious about this, and agreed to take him on as a teacher. And he eventually became Bodhidharma's successor. And one of the things that he did was he said, everything you need to know is right here. And this is the Lanka Avatara Sutra. And he said, this is the Buddhism that I teach coalesced into a one place, and it's everything you're ever going to need to know. So that's pretty interesting. And I didn't even know this sutra existed, or I'd seen the name, but I didn't know what it was until I started preparing for this talk. And it's very interesting. It's very, very perplexing, but here's where we get the idea in Buddhism that the world in front of us is not what is not real. What we are dealing with is our own perceptions. The things that we create in our own mind is what we perceive to be the universe in front of us. So interesting idea. The earliest translations that anybody can put their hands on of this sutra are from the 600s. There is allegedly a translation into Chinese from 420 from Sanskrit that nobody has ever seen. It's never surfaced, but it's allegedly out there somewhere. So most of our Mahayana canon that's in Chinese starts showing up at the 6th and 7th century. Okay, so Bodhidharma must have had an earlier copy. in probably in Sanskrit, and that is what he taught from. But what is happening here in this sutra is the Buddha is having a discourse with a guy named Mahimata in a place called Lanka, and Lanka was a heavily fortified island that we now know of as Sri Lanka or Ceylon. And this was another kingdom that was conquered by Ashoka around 250 that he sent Buddhist emissaries to. So it's possible that this comes out of that Lankan tradition and had traveled with Ashoka's emissaries to the Bactrian region and entered China through the Silk Road with Bodhidharma. So when asking the question of these Middle Eastern schools of Buddhism that have vanished, they were all wiped out in the 7th century by the spread of Islam. Where did these teachings go? And how different are they from what we know now? Well, I think it's possible that these are them. Similarly to the way that every European is carrying about 5% Neanderthal DNA, even though we presume the Neanderthals are extinct. In a way, they're kind of not. In a way, they live on through us, because we're all of us Europeans are carrying a certain amount of Neanderthal DNA. So I think it's possible, and it'll be impossible to ever prove, but this is something to think about, that through travel along the Silk Road, this Middle Eastern version of Buddhism is still extant with the teachings that the wanderers that went into China took with them. And as we've seen, this was a very vibrant community, even as late as the 6th century. Thousands of monks, large monasteries, enough capital to build these huge statues. That we're now looking at the 20th anniversary of the destruction of these statues. But here's something that's interesting about what's still there. They have suspended archaeological work in this area since Afghanistan is such an unstable region politically and militarily. But UNESCO has always had it in the back of their mind that they would eventually restore these statues if it was all possible. Most of the pieces of the statues have been removed because the next leader of Afghanistan recounted what the Taliban had done, said it was a horrible, egregious act to the history of the entire planet, and vowed that he would do what he could to make things right. So most of the pieces of the statues that they could excavate have been excavated. There has been some repair done to the bases of the statues. And in 2008, a 65-foot long statue of the reclining Buddha was found in this valley. And allegedly, somewhere in this valley is a 300-meter statue of the Buddha. That may be completely folkloric, but that's what the folklore tells us is out there. So a couple of things to think about. This is I think the point. I think Ashoka's reign was the point where this movement that we now know of as Buddhism, the teachings of the Buddha, actually left the Indian subcontinent for probably the first time in about 250 BC, and are the two areas that we know of that it went to were this kingdom of Bactria, where it came in contact with Hellenistic ideas and Hellenistic principles, traveled into China via the Silk Road over the next few hundred years, culminating in this historical character of Bodhidharma. And the Lanka Vara, and we see Lanka, the name of the kingdom where this discourse took place, being used in this sutra. And so this Lanka of Avatara, you look at those two words, the Lanka and this is the root word of the word avatar, where this root comes from. And if in the Sri Lankan Buddhist traditions, they allege that Buddha actually visited Sri Lanka 3 times in his lifetime and left these teachings. So I posit that this is our remnant of Middle Eastern Buddhism, of these schools that no longer exist, that were, or at least partially, that made it into China through the Silk Road. So I'd like to open it up to the floor and see if you guys have any questions and comments.
Yep, Sensei.
He's got
Shinjin is Sensei, I'm Hojo. Just wanted to comment that there's another good source on this, which is Gary Ferguson's book on tracing Bodhidharma through China. He wrote a very great book about finding evidence of Bodhidharma's actual sojourn through China, and still in the records there. Rice paper and ink last a long time. Yeah, I can't remember the name of it. I think it was Tracing Bodhidharma Through China or something. Gary Ferguson is the guy who wrote Zen's Chinese Heritage.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very good source for tracing Bodhidharmas. But the Lankavatara Sutra, I think, implies, Shinjin, you might say a little bit more about this, that Buddha himself actually went into Sri Lanka. He traveled into Sri Lanka at one time.
Yeah, well, according to the Sri Lankan traditions, he was there 3 separate times that in his lifetime, and left teachings. And you know, it's really tough to know. I mean, you know, we do have the history that we do know is that Ashoka sent emissaries, including his own son, to teach Buddhism in Sri Lanka.
So Shinjin Sensei,
Yeah.
I know I've heard the story about how Buddhism transitioned over, and then, you know, it culturally started picking things up as it went along. What do you, when you said you remember where you were with these statues? I think I do too, when the statues were destroyed. Has there been any take on the information, how that impacted the residents of that area with the?
Yeah, it was interesting because what got me on the subject of this was I had to travel down to Florida to work, and I was listening to NPR, and one of the prisoners at Guantanamo is the guy that allegedly was the explosive expert that blew the statues up, and one of the you know, things they talked about in this NPR piece was that couldn't have possibly been true, and they've done more and more research that he wasn't even in Afghanistan at that time. He was a 22-year-old kid, and after he was one of the people that was arrested at Tora Bora, and other prisoners said, "Oh yeah, that guy over there is the explosives guy. He's the guy that blew up those statues in Afghanistan." And he was also a major military advisor to Osama bin Laden. And they can't verify any of this, but this guy's still in prison in Guantanamo. So they talked to one of the guys, and he's a British archaeologist, and I can't remember his name, but they tried to talk to him. His area of expertise, his life's research, was on the Buddhist artifacts in Afghanistan. And 20 years later, this guy is still so distraught over the destruction of those statues that he can't speak about it. And so he told NPR that he couldn't do an interview, that he wouldn't be able to do it. But one of the things about this valley is there's cave region. You know, it's full of caves, and these caves have never not been inhabited. And so there were people living in these caves and carrying out normal lives when in 2001 when this happened. And they apparently, there was interview, you know, NPR went back there, went back to Bamiyan and interviewed many people that were living there, and they're still upset about it. They're like, it didn't make any sense to us. You know, we thought the statues were beautiful, even if we're not Buddhists. And you know, and there's still a lot of things that weren't destroyed by the Taliban there. This is still a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so there's still a lot of murals and a lot of statuary that still survives. But yeah, Hojo.
Yeah, just a little bit more on that. It's one of the ironies here, one of the great ironies. If you're hearing a little bit of an echo, it's because that GarageBand reverb is still on or something. I don't know. When I heard about that, it was one of those egregious. It's, you know, you don't. It's almost as you feel funny about, guilty or whatever about getting upset over something like this. There's been many other instances where world history treasures have been destroyed for weird reasons. As a designer, you know, I've always appreciated the archaeology, the architecture, these wonderful time capsule type records we've had around the world that reveal so much about humanity's past. But the irony, one of the ironies, and you're bringing out a kind of a double irony, that the Kavatara is all about how our immediate perception is itself skewed. And this is a very, you know, known issue in Zen. And part of what we try to overcome, penetrate through in our meditation, see beyond our senses, you might say. And so for it to be further distorted for sociological, ideological reasons, that these people who destroyed these statues saw them in a way that is not even appropriate to the people who built them. So once they destroyed the statues, what they did was reveal the true form of Buddha, which is the mountain behind the statue. So this is Dogen's, you know, the mountains and rivers, the body and voice of Buddha and so forth. So it's just such total, complete ignorance of what they think they're doing. They're treating these as idols. And we have conservative Christians who also treat what we do as idol worship. It's total, complete ignorance and an unwillingness to understand anything outside their own framework of how they see reality. So it's beyond, they're not even beginning to get to the level of perception itself as being distorted. It's their whole worldview is completely screwed up and upside down, topsy-turvy. So for me, it was doubly frustrating to see this ignorance, but you feel guilty because it, you know, when you look at what the Taliban and others such crusaders in history and around the world have done, they wipe out all kinds, you know, millions and millions of people. And so you'd have to say to yourself, well, the artifacts aren't that important then. You know, they're wiping out people. Well, people are only going to live 70, 80 years, 90, you know, 100 years at most. But these artifacts are there for millennia, and they have something to teach us. And millions of people built the pyramids, or thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. So you're kind of wiping out, when you wipe out these artifacts, you are also destroying life. But it's an anomaly, it's a contradiction in terms, it's all of those dilemmas that we have. But when you see people acting out of this kind of ignorance, it's just doubly insulting, you might say, to your intelligence and, to the wisdom of Buddhism.
Yeah, as I was researching this, I came across one of the interesting things is the Afghan government is proposing like a tourist trail of the remaining Buddhist sites in Afghanistan, and apparently there's several. There's two in the Samangan region, two large monasteries that were built in the 6th century that are still standing, and apparently they haven't been destroyed because most of their structures are actually underground, carved into the rock underground. So they're still there. Tak-i-Rustan and Tepi-i-Rustan were both apparently centers of Buddhist training in the 5th and 6th centuries that are still there. So I think it's interesting that all is not lost. But yeah, I remember having a horrible reaction to the destruction of those statues. Like I said, I was about 5 years in as a Buddhist.
One of our neighborhood restaurants has pictures of them on the wall before they were destroyed.
Yeah, but I think kind of the interesting parallel is we can almost look at it as all of these schools of Buddhism disappearing in the 7th century and being totally gone by the 9th century. Buddhism ceased to exist in the Middle East by the 9th century. That was by the time all of these regions had become fully Islamic. And so,
yep. By the way, that area, Gandhara, was where the first imagery, my understanding is the first imagery, iconography representing Buddha and any bodhisattvas started to appear, because they were known for sculpture in that region.
mm-hmm.
And up until then, Buddha had only been represented by those statues that show his footprints, for instance, and they'd have an empty chair and a painting, and they have his horse, but they would not show his image. So it's similar to other religions in the Middle East where it's prohibited to try to show the image of the founder.
Right. And I think that's where the Greek influence comes in, because it's, Greek tradition to display the gods and goddesses. And so this area before Ashoka had conquered it, before he had conquered Bactria, was under the control of Alexander the Great's former army. So, yeah.
Comments from Facebook. We had Jerry Garner. Thanks so much for your comments. Tracking Bodhidharma, a journey of the heart of the Chinese culture. And then David Edas, he said, it makes you wonder about content between early Christians and Buddhists who could have been in the region at the time, especially in the area around the Constantinople.
Yeah, I think that's a completely feasible way to look at it, because even though the Roman records about Buddhism and the Greek records about Buddhism are really sketchy, hardly much mentioned beyond there was like a quote, I can't even, I've read it, but I didn't write it down in the notebook here, as a Roman writer that said, yeah, we have these people called Buddhists, and they revere their leader, their founder, Buddha, as a god because of his great sanctity. And this would have been written around around that period, the age of the beginning of Christianity. So these people, they knew of Buddhism. Buddhism was certainly present probably in the larger cities, but the Romans just didn't keep any record of it. So we really don't know exactly what they were up to. But I think it's been a theory of a lot of people throughout time that Buddhism may have been one of the areas where the early Christians got a lot of their ideas. You can find that reference in a lot of places. So it's not impossible.
Mhm.
I would say.
Mhm.
Yeah, John.
Shinji and Sensei, when you were researching this, did you come across any references to the city of Balkh in modern day Iran, which was part of Bactria?
I did not. Fill us in.
So get this, the word Shambhala is thought to be, which is like a paradise concept mostly in Tibetan Buddhism, is thought to be a translation of the sort of Proto-Persian name Shams-e-Balkh, which means like Shams means sun. It's actually the same in Hebrew, or Shemesh. It's the same root as in Hebrew. And so it's believed to be a sun worship temple in Bactria that contributed sort of the mythological and just this whole city, which is this big confluence of a bunch of different religions, so created sort of the seed idea, it's believed, of Shambhala that made it to Tibet and into Buddhism. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about this connection is that it was a huge area of activity for Sufi mystics. And there's a whole thread of people into Sufism who believe that it predates Islam, that Islam actually encountered Sufis and incorporated them. They found a lot of metaphysical alignment with each other, and Sufis became Muslim and began to teach Muslims, but that this sort of mysticism predates Islam. And so there's this other thread. I've seen some of this stuff about Christianity as well, but of course it all seems kind of mixed together, that sort of Middle Eastern monotheistic is probably not that's probably like a Western academic version of what we're really talking about, but there's a sort of monistic, like Middle Eastern mystical religion mixed in with these pivotal encounters in early Buddhism that spread to China and to Japan, and became the Buddhism that we know. And there's this one city in Bactria that seems to be sort of the nexus of all of it, that is the real life Shambhala.
That's really very interesting. And that's something I have to admit I don't know that much about. When it comes to Sufism, I've read Idris Shah's book, and that's been about it. But it always, like on a very superficial level, the relationship between Sufism and mainstream Islam always kind of reminded me of the relationship between Zen and mainstream Buddhism. There just seems to be a little, or even the relationship between Kabbalistic Judaism and mainstream Judaism. So, I mean, we have this recurring theme that kind of taps into what I hear you saying. And I think that one of the things that could tie all this together is the Silk Road itself. This was how people were getting from one end of the continent to the other. And if you walk, think about it, if you started walking the Silk Road, like let's say you left from Jerusalem and walked all the way into China, think about how much you would come in contact with. I mean, just, if you sat down and talked to mystics all along the road, just how many different ideas you would come up with, and at the same time, how many common threads they all shared. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll look into that. Yeah, Hojo.
And then on a lighter note, when it came to the shores of America, it became what is known in current vernacular as shambolic.
Shambolic, yeah. Yeah.
I like that the comment that John was saying, because it's just kind of like you get the meshing of the different cultures together, and you see that. Yeah. I would love for in the future for us to have a conversation about what Buddhism is morphing into the United States and the Western culture, because as you were talking about the Silk Road and the Tibetan and their shamanistic teachings that were brought in, you can clearly see that in Tibetan Buddhism, in the imagery and in the teaching and in a lot of their ceremonial things, as well as China and Japan and So it's going to be interesting to me what is kind of rolling out of Western Buddhism as a contribution to the expansion of Buddhism into the Western culture.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you have to keep in mind that Tibetan Buddhism is in a lot of ways is not that old. It's Milarepa lived what, about 1400? Yeah, so it hasn't had a chance to like, or not say haven't had a chance, that implies that it's something that should happen, but a lot of its shamanistic roots and animistic roots are still right there on display. And who's to say in another 1500 years if they'll still be there? But yeah, that's a great question. Is what is America bringing to Buddhism now? Because Buddhism, every culture that Buddhism has gone to, that culture has changed Buddhism and reinvented Buddhism for itself. So, we're at 70 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. For me, because we're meshed in culturally in the United States, it's not a distinct culture. It's not homogenous. So that's for me, what's going to be the impact? Are you going to see a lot of cultural impacts? I mean, it's relatively still a small tradition here in the United States, but what is that going to look like? Because it's not like it's coming out of a China, which has a very distinct cultural impact, right? Japan's it's very homogenous cultural impact. So what is that going to look like here? It's
if you look at American culture, like we do to everything else, we're going to bring our best and our worst. We're going to bring Thomas Jefferson and Miles Davis to it, but we're also going to bring Justin Bieber, and Donald Trump. I mean, we're this culture of these like extremes. Yeah. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think one of the things that is kind of interesting is that, if you talk about Buddhism in America, the vast majority of people immediately go to the beat writers and, kind of the hippie movement of the 60s. That's what kind of most people think we are, the kind of amalgamation of those two things. And I'll be the first to admit the beat writers were my gateway drug to this. I got interested in this because I read, Kerouac and Neil Cassidy and Allen Ginsberg. Yeah.
Just a plug for my book. In the original Frontier, I introduced Daniel Goldman's analysis of that flowering of Buddhism or Zen in the United States in the 60s. And of course, my introduction to Zen was a part of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of begs the question, kind of pulling this back into what we've been talking about is, what would have been a typical Chinese person with a spiritual bent? What would have been their reaction, to this Persian madman holding up in a cave and staring at the wall?
And Sensei, we have a comment from David about what we were just talking about. He says, I think the Western contribution will be an emphasis on the practical aspects of secularization. At least that's the approach I came to Zen from. Maybe also a sort of meshing of mysticism and secularism. Buddhism feels like it fits that worldview. That real world is in and of itself also mystical.
Yeah. There's a couple of things to unpack there. I think that's a great comment. I think, one, he really kind of paraphrased that wonderful quote by Ludwig Wittgenstein. It's not why the world is it's mystical, it's that the world is at all that's mystical. I think he paraphrased that. But the other thing is that one of the things that I think, and maybe it's just not just America, but I think modern times will bring to Buddhism is it's the only spiritual tradition that I can think of that is never in direct opposition with science. And so the more that we know about the function of the brain, the more we understand the effect that sitting has. In a lot of ways, the more because the Buddha, when he taught, and when Bodhidharma taught, when Dogen taught, even when Suzuki taught at the first part of the last century, they didn't know what the sections of the brain did. You know, they didn't know what the amygdala was doing. They didn't know what the prefrontal cortex was doing. And so there was no way that they would know what effect sitting or the practice of Buddhism would have on your brain, on your psyche, on your personality. And I think that that may be modern times great contribution to Buddhism, is that the same way, and you know, Corolla can speak to this, is the same way we keep proving Einstein's original ideas right. I think that science is going to continue to prove the Buddha's original ideas right.
I always like the fact that Buddhism says, don't take it from my perspective, go and see what if it works for you. I love that it kind of pushes it for you to do the experimentation at your own personal level.
Yeah, well, allegedly that was the Buddha's last words to his monks. Oh, my monks, be a light unto yourself. I can't figure this out for you. You've got to do it.
And go back to Hojei Sensei's comment, is my enlightenment, your enlightenment is your enlightenment.
Your enlightenment, your enlightenment. Yeah.
And Matsuoka would add to that, you can't get mine and I can't get yours. So stop trying.
Stop trying.
Yep. And David says, response, I agree with that as well. For me, a large reason why Zen has stuck with me, or I have stuck with it, is that, hold on, I went down, is that I do not feel a conflict with my day-to-day experience of the world.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, it's like your day-to-day experiences are constantly either disproving or proving, or your experimentation with the practice, and we're working with the self and whatever arises through that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And from my own experience, I think, you know, the first thing that jumps out to me, you know, I was raised Jewish and taught to read Hebrew and read the Old Testament. And I was also formally trained as a scientist. It's two really tough things to reconcile. You know, I mean, you study the theory of evolution. Well, it's not a theory, evolution's a fact, but you study evolution, and the book of Genesis, you know, it's tough to pull those things together, even when you can read it in the original language. And you don't have that with Buddhism.
Okay, Sensei.
Since nobody else is jumping in, I keep jumping in. If somebody else will talk, I'll shut up. But evolution, I think a big part of the conflict, again, ideological or mental conflict, it doesn't really exist in reality, between evolution and creationism, which I talk about in the next book, more on the social role and place of Zen in our culture, with the extremes of rationalism on one end, the extremes of theism on the other. Zen is sort of right down the middle. One of the big category errors that the creationists make is they discuss evolution as if it is a theory of origins or first causes. It's nothing of the sort. It's a pattern within the development of species that is very easy to recognize and very easy to, not easy, but it's very recognizable and very provable. It has nothing to do with how everything began. It's not like the Big Bang. The Big Bang is the theory they want to argue, if they want to argue a theory. Evolution has nothing to do with creationism, other than God's way of evolving species.
So I have to bring this up, and this is a dedication to Shikaku, because he's always talking about time. And we've been reading, Returning to Silence, Category Roshi on the Mondays. And really, last week we had a conversation about how it's really not that point in time. It's like a whole spectrum. It's not like a before and an after. It's not that one point. So he's really trying to get us to kind of lift our focus away from a point in time, the before and after in time. So I'll be interested to see if Shikaku has anything to say related to that, the time, because he's always delving into time. So as it relates to what you just said, Hojo Sensei.
This is not the time for a comment.
I just wanted to say in passing that I know it was a mispronunciation, but what I heard April say is category Roshi.
Category.
Category Roshi.
I like that.
That's a category, all right.
Chicago, you kind of sounded like John Cage. I have nothing to say, so I'm saying it.
All that makes all the cameras come on.
All the cameras go on. Yeah, that's how to pull them out of their holes.
Yeah.
I just don't feel time is. Let me prepare, and in a year I'll be ready to comment. Thank you.
All right. All right. Yeah. David, I think you were next, and then John.
Yeah. So thank you for this. This is enjoyable. Can you would you mind sharing more about kind of what you ran up to, what you ran up against as a Buddha, as a Zen practitioner, having practiced, I think, for around 5 years, when all of this, this destruction happened? I mean, what was the point that you hit in your practice? And then how did that sort of resolve, and what did you take away from that as a result of, this, objectively, this massive amount of destruction?
Well, one of the things that I had to face in myself, being raised Jewish in America, in a conservative family, that the deck was already stacked in my own brain. I already had somewhat of an anti-Arab sentiment. I already had somewhat of an anti-Arab prejudice. So when this happened, I had, there was this impulse inside of me that said, well, this is the kind of thing these people are going to do anyway. And I had to kind of face my own prejudices, for one thing, on one hand. So that it brought up that, and that's something you still have to face, I think, as an American, and even as an American Jew. I mean, we have a lot of anti-Arab and anti-Islamic racism, and it's around us all the time in subtle ways that we don't even know. Like go back and watch the original Star Trek series. The Evil Empire, the Klingons, they all look like Arabs, and they're portrayed by Middle Eastern actors most of the time. And that's gonna start affecting your psyche when you're exposed to little bits of that. So I think that was one thing that I had to contend with. And of course, 9/11 happened 6 months later, and once again we have to contend with this anti-Arab sentiment. A handful of insane people do not equate the a quarter of the world's population. And one of the things that was most impactful, an event that was really impactful for me, about 2014, 15, I was in Morocco, and I was there in the summertime, and that was when we had that mass shooting in a nightclub in Orlando. Random guy walked up to me and he goes, "You're American?" I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "I'm so sorry about Orlando." And no group of people are complete animals. There's no such thing as an evil empire. Mm-hmm. Madmen will do crazy things, but that's something we all have to face in ourselves. We're inherently biased against groups of people that don't look like us, and that's something we're carrying around in our genes from the times that we were hunters and gatherers. Somebody that didn't look like you could be there to steal your access to water, your food, your mates. They may be carrying diseases you don't have any immunity to. So it's it's a genetic defense mechanism that's within us very deeply. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, do the exact same thing, but we have the opportunity to transcend that and not view other people that way. And I think Buddhism is one of the most powerful mechanisms we have to achieve that transcendence. So I think that was my takeaway one of my takeaways when those statues came down.
Hey, John, Sensei, we get John and then we'll get you.
David, did that help at all? Okay. John.
Yes, thank you. I'm pleased to be visiting today. And as a
Welcome.
visitor, I welcome any coaching as far as respect and protocol. Uh, I was I was triggered and encouraged to respond when I heard Hojo Sensei. Is that the I see the label is Michael Elliston, but I believe it's Hojo Sensei. Have I got that right?
Yeah, Hojo is the abbot, and I'm kind of the vice abbot. I'm kind of second in command, right hand man kind of thing.
Okay. So
Yeah.
please overlook any how do I say it? Any personal discretions here. I encountered Michael Elliston about 35 years ago when I was young enough to drive back and forth from Carrollton, and I treasure those memories. And I want to mention one. When I mentioned to Hojo Sensei how much I enjoyed the gathering at Emory of all the Zen masters coming in from all over the United States, I'll never forget the response. It went something like this: "Yes, John, that was one of the biggest headaches of my life." And true to form, I haven't seen any more gatherings of Zen masters from all over the United States. Um, I want you to know that I'm anticipating moving to Atlanta to finalize and finish the last chapter of my life. And part of that would be to start having a much more connective, supportive relationship with the Atlanta Soto Zen Center. So I'm excited about that. Thank you for listening. Here's the spark that came up. When you mentioned, Hojo Sensei, the total misunderstanding of the Christians and the origin as opposed to evolution and creation, what I've noticed living in the Bible Belt, the red Bible Belt, is that there appears to be that strong emotional reaction to connecting human beings to monkeys. The Christians see us as made in the image of God. And I saw that so clearly, experience, I'd like to think might be a little more interesting. I was walking through the Smithsonian, and as many of you probably may recall, they've laid out in very, very clear detail our connection to apes and monkeys. I mean, they've got it all there. It's footnoted. It's all there. And I'll never forget a gentleman turning to his son as we walked out, and he says, "I don't care what they say, son. We did not come from monkeys." So shower me with facts, shower me with science, but and Hojo Sensei, I welcome your response to this. There is some kind of energy out there that will not change. Possibly it might die off with generations. But hey, thank you for your patience.
It's good to see you again, John. I look forward to seeing you again in person when you get back to Atlanta. And, there's a couple of answers in Zen. The harmony of sameness and difference says we're a hell of a lot more a monkey than we are a porpoise, for instance, right? I mean, you can kind of see that. So, but I understand the resistance to coming from monkeys, but monkeys did not come from monkeys. You know, if anything came from God, everything came from God. And so everything is in God's image, not just human beings. In Buddhism, we have this intelligence or self-awareness. They say even cows recognize themselves in the mirror. Somehow they've proven it, I don't know how. So we're not alone. All the other sentient beings are embraced in the Sangha in Buddhism. It's understood that the human birth is the yoki, Japanese yoki, pivot point, the central qualification for being able to have spiritual awakening. But we share this Buddha nature. Buddha simply means awake. Chickens, dogs, cats, and cows, they're all awake to a certain degree. And people, you can argue that earthworms and trees, the plant kingdom is awake to a certain degree. So, you know, it's hard. We don't argue these points. As soon as you start to argue, you have lost. But we hope that people can come to see this for themselves, see the wisdom of Buddha's teachings for themselves. Welcome back to Atlanta.
Okay.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, if nobody has anything else, we'll go ahead and close out. Or
Just the short one I was wanting to say before with Shikok's commentary on time, I'd like to quote Master Jagger on that. Time is on my side. Yes, it is.
And Shinjin Sensei, we did want to give a couple of minutes to Muman to talk about the Gasho newsletter.
that's right. I remember. Yeah.
Yes. So again, thanks everyone. Thanks Sensei Shinjin for your teaching as always. And
Thank
now
you.
we'll hand it over to Mumon, Amy Pico, to speak about the Gasho newsletter.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I hope I didn't catch you off a time there.
And next month we'll be back to India, and we'll pick up and we'll talk about some of the Indian patriarchs. So over to Amy.
Next week, I'm giving a contemporary talk. I got to put in a plug.
Okay.
That's it.
That's it.
That's the plug. Okay, cool. Gasho, Shinjin and Hojo for the talk this morning. It's, you know, these are the new areas that I'm learning about in Zen, and it's good to know the history. It's good to know the history. So Gasho newsletter. For those of you that know what I'm talking about, great. If not, this is our newly reinvigorated prison newsletter project. And I won't go into a ton of the background, because if you are interested in knowing more about Gasho newsletter, I would encourage you to look at our newsletter for April. Fusatsu has put a little blurb in our newsletter for April around Gasho newsletter. And if you would like to actually see the newsletter, we mailed out our first batch a few weeks ago to almost 700 inmates all over the country, which is quite impressive mailing list over the last however many 20 some odd years that the mailing list has been around. So we're really excited to keep it going. So in order for it to keep going, this is where I need support from our Sangha. And you can read more about that in the newsletter, but the two items that I wanted to bring up to you all in terms of support. If you are thinking about specific ways that you want to support, ASZC, but really this specific project. We self-funded the project for this first round because we needed to do that, but we want the Sangha to be able to fund future newsletters going out. We were able to secure a nonprofit mailing status. So the mailing rates that we got are really affordable, but it is still going to cost us. We're estimating this next newsletter, which will probably be going out in September, to be even larger than this one, because we're going to be getting more people probably asking to get on. So the mailing costs, could be upwards of $200. We're not, this last one was under 200. So we're looking for both financial support so that we can do another issue for our mailing list. But then the other area that we're also looking for support is actually having physical bodies to help with the actual distribution of the newsletters, because these are paper, we're doing paper mailings, right? And so for those of you that are local to Atlanta, I'm going to probably be coming on here a few more times, because if we do not have physical bodies to help us with both the folding, the stuffing, and actually physically getting them to the post office, sorting the mail, this is actually a lot of work. I think I logged somewhere close to 10 hours just in the logistics of folding and getting it all. So I'm looking for helpers. And if you are local to the area and you want to have an actual real impact for practitioners, that this is one of the ways that they get exposure, right? We're offering them practice feedback. Sensei is answering questions from inmates. There's a lot of really useful things in there. And so I'm really looking forward to, including more people in this beautiful project and allowing us to continue forward, because ultimately, if we either A, don't get funding for it, or B, we don't have the proper help, this won't remain sustainable in the long term. This is a huge undertaking, and I'd love to keep it going. So for those of you that are, maybe piqued with interest or would like to know more, my email address is going to be attached to the little blurb in the newsletter, but I will put it here in the chat as well. Please feel free to contact me. And I will definitely be able to direct you to ways in which you can absolutely help with this project. So there's probably other things I could say about it, but I wanted to keep it brief because I know we all want to go probably have lunch like I do. So, but Gasho, everyone, thank you for your time. And Sensei.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that an animated Gasho for Amy. Pumon. Homon, right? H-O-M-O-N?
Mumon.
Oh, Mumon. Look, we have a lot of Dharma gates in our Sangha. So Brian Price, also Chishiki.
Yes.
And we've done this before, and I congratulate Amy and Brian in pulling this together. It's not an easy task, but I think on the financial end of it, we'll bring this up to the Silent Thunder Order Board of Directors. I think we should look to the entire Mahasangha to fund this kind of operation. It's not technically an Atlanta Soto Zen Center function, but we're the training center, and so we initiate these things. But I think we can look to the larger network of people for the financial support as well. We'll bring that up at one of the future board meetings.
Yep. Since we did bring it up this week,
Okay.
For that, and also Mumon, hopefully early this week, prior to the newsletter, we'll be getting the Gasho page up. So there will be a link off the teachings that would have the overview, the contact information, and also how you can help. So that's coming along, as well as we created a button to be able to offering for people who want to do that. So again, Mumon and Shishiki, thank you so much for your efforts as the Dharma evolves into supporting the community. This is Dharma in action.
One other function of this newsletter, we will put a stuffer in it about the original Frontier book, because we think prisons buy books for their libraries that the prisoners want. And so possibly we'll sell the original Frontier into some of these prisons for the use of the inmates to learn how to do meditation in the absence of having somebody like us come in and do it. We had a prison program for maybe 10 years where we got up to 6 or 8 prisons, but it became unmanageable. This is one way to get the word of Zen meditation into the prisons, answer the questions of the inmates, and also get instructional material in their hands. So it's propagating Zen in monasteries that are already built.
Absolutely. One last thing, I would be remiss if I did not include a few more names because I did not do this completely alone or just with Chi. Alyssa Hutchins, one of our newer practitioners as well, helped with the design of the newsletter. And Keusak and Inga also offered a few of their resources. Inga created a beautiful graphic for Zazen basics. So really, this was a collective effort, but we want it to be an even more collective effort. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And before we end, as always, we have a few announcements. Again, we're looking very forward to Ungan, Bill Mayhew, that's going to be coming in April to do an ongo. He'll be one of our priests in residence. So we look forward to him speaking and working and being available for questions. So you'll be seeing a lot of Ungan in April. Ungan, did you want to say anything about your?
Yeah, Amy, I'll probably be able to find a little time next month to help you stuff envelopes or something, as long as it doesn't interfere with my nap time.
All right.
And as always, we have a lot of practice opportunities that are occurring in the week. So please check out the offerings online. Again, please check out Sensei's book. It's available. We have a page reference to the original frontier to support our abbot and our founder and the propagation of Zen. We're excited about that. Next week, he's going to be, I think, speaking of some content from the original frontier and the contemporary discussion. And as always, we are so grateful to everyone that continues to support our Sangha, because this is the way that we keep things going, like the Gasho newsletter, offering Sensei speaking on Sundays and keeping residential opportunities available. So we're so grateful for your support. And if you're not a supporter, we would love for you to consider becoming a supporter, a consistent giver. And that note, if there are no further ado, we will use our closing verses, Sensei. And again, everyone, thank you and happy spring. And also, we want to send out some of our merit and our energy to the Asian American and our Asian community that has lost some of their members this week. All right, thank you so very much.
Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Stay safe.